public session. In today's meeting, we meet with Jim Clarkin, Chief Executive, Oxfam Ireland, and Dina El Mamoun, Head of Policy and Advocacy in Yemen, Oxfam International. You are both very welcome here today, together with your colleagues attending in the public gallery. The members of the committee look forward to hearing your evidence on the current humanitarian situation in Yemen. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and persons in the public gallery to turn off their mobile phones. Members are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient for members to just put their phones on silent mode, as this would maintain the level of interference with the broadcasting system. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and they are asked to respect the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or body outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And now I call on Mr Clarkin to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. And could I just thank you all for giving us the opportunity here today to discuss the situation in Yemen with you. I had the opportunity of mentioning it on Morning Ireland this morning, so hopefully we'll get some further expanded interest in it. We appeared before this committee 2 years ago when Yemen was first on the brink of famine. It's heartbreaking to see that we're here again as Yemen continues to experience the world's worst humanitarian crisis. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Dina El Mamoun, who's our International Head of Policy and Advocacy living in Yemen. And since 2015, Oxfam has been working with local partner organisations in 8 governorates in Yemen, and we've reached more than 3 million people with water and sanitation, cash assistance and food vouchers. This assistance is essential for mitigating the devastating effects of the protracted conflict, which is bringing new suffering and civilian damage on a daily basis. We're now in the 4th year of the conflict, and people are being pushed beyond their limits. Dina will speak to the rapidly changing situation in the country itself, but just to remind the committee members of the scale of the crisis we're facing is what I'm going to try and do at the initial stage. So between March 2015 and August 2018, the conflict has led to a total of 17,062 civilian casualties. It has forced over 3 million people from their homes. 24.1 million people, that's 80% of the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance, including 14.3 million people in acute need. Yemen is currently experiencing a 3rd wave of the world's worst cholera outbreak, with 2 previous waves from October 2016 to March 2018. So over 1.5 million suspected cholera cases, including 3,024 deaths in Yemen since October 2016. 22 of the 23 governorates of the country are now affected by cholera. Without prevention measures being put in place urgently and a rapid and unhindered scale-up response, the outbreak will turn into an epidemic as the rainy season approaches us. As committee members are aware, food security in Yemen is critically dependent on imports and incomes, both of which have been knowingly undermined by parties to the conflict over many months. Very little food is grown in Yemen, so approximately 90% of the country's food has to be imported, 70% of that coming through Hodeida port. Actions that have obstructed food availability and accessibility include the Saudi-led coalition disrupting food and other supplies coming into Hodeida and Salif ports through blockades, inspection processes, delaying of vessels or diversion. While imports of bulk foods such as wheat, rice and sugar are underway, containers are blocked, preventing the offloading of supplies of milk powder, cooking oil, medicines and other goods. Hodeida seaport is the most important point of entry for food, fuel and medicines needed for 20 million Yemenis in the northern governorates to prevent famine and a recurrence of a cholera epidemic. Any disruption or attack on the port which results in cutting off imports means cutting off the lifeline, not just for the people of Hodeida but for the entire country. It's worth emphasising that international humanitarian law, underscored by UN Security Council Resolution 2417, requires all parties to conflicts to ensure that they do not target civilians and objects necessary for food production and distribution, or objects that are indispensable to the survival of civilian population, including crops, livestock and water sources. Yemen's economy has been shattered. Since 2015, the economy was halved, and very few Yemenis have any source of income. More than 80% now live below the poverty line. Salaries for many workers in the public sector have not been paid for 2 years, leaving many people destitute. The exchange rate has faced severe shocks and fluctuated sharply since the escalation of the conflict. The central bank has struggled to ensure liquidity in the market, making it difficult for importers to bring supplies into the country. Fighting and financial constraints have led to the closure of 35% of businesses and a shrinking of over 51% of surviving firms. As a result, food prices have been pushed so high that essential supplies have become too expensive for most people. In October 2018, retail food prices commodities were 73 to 178% higher than in the pre-crisis period, and fuel prices have risen at an even higher rate, and that's obviously essential for distribution. Sustained undermining of food imports, availability and plummeting incomes have clear and unequivocal humanitarian consequences. 14 million people, half the population of Yemen, face a clear and present danger of imminent famine. And 20 million, two-thirds of the population, are relied on food aid to survive. Yemenis are resilient people, but the current situation is the worst we have seen, and it keeps deteriorating. In surveys late last year of the people in Taiz, southern Yemen, who have received assistance from Oxfam, 99% said the adults in the family had reduced how much they eat to give more food to their children, and 98% had cut down the number of meals they were eating every day. More than half said they had borrowed food from friends or relatives. Almost two-thirds of people we spoke to said they'd taken on debt. In almost all cases, this was to buy food, medicine or water. Coping mechanisms for many Yemenis have become more and more desperate. Oxfam has spoken to families in Amran Governorate in the north of Yemen who, hungry and isolated after fleeing their homes, have been forced to marry off their daughters, in one case a child as young as 3 years old, to buy food and shelter to save the rest of the family. Although early marriage has long been a dire practice in Yemen, marrying off girls at such an early age is pure desperation to buy food. It's absolutely shocking. We know the situation of food shortage. Women eat least and last. Yemeni women face one of the world's greatest gender-based disparities, and this imbalance is clearly evident when it comes to food security and nutrition. Escalating food shortages have left an estimated 1.1 million pregnant and lactating women malnourished and threatened the lives of 75,000 women who are likely to develop complications during childbirth, including the stunted growth of their newborns. Even with humanitarian assistance, women give priority to children or other family members, or use the money for other household needs. An assessment after one Oxfam distribution found that 14% of respondents from female-headed households still had a poor food consumption score compared to 6% of male-headed households. Under conditions of conflict characterised by displacement, loss of personal security, family instability and lack of access to rights, Yemeni women and girls are exposed to many risks, including gender-based violence. A protection survey carried out in November 2018 found that women experience the highest levels of all violence, psychological, physical and sexual, and that overall girls were impacted more by all forms of violence than boys. We also are aware that there is likely to be a vast underreporting of sexual violence as survivors face stigmatisation. The international humanitarian response of which we are a part is saving lives, but it is still taking place in a hugely challenging environment. Conflict, security constraints and the harassment of humanitarian workers are just some of the challenges being faced in accessing the hardest to reach areas without compromising the safety and security of those we work with, our local partner organisations and our own staff. The only real solution to the crisis in Yemen is political. Talks in Sweden at the beginning of December were the first since 2016 that the warring parties both attended. This was a big first step. However, despite an agreed ceasefire in the city and port of Hodeida, 3 civilians are still being killed every day, 1 person every 8 hours. The international community needs to maintain pressure on all parties to the conflict to ensure ceasefire agreements are honoured and there is a quick return to negotiations. It is essential that the peace process is inclusive, with the active and meaningful participation of women, civil society and youth. While women bear the burden of war, they are not passive victims. Women are leading efforts to increase the resilience of their communities, and they're contributing to peace building at local level through resolving conflicts over resources such as water and land. Though gender norms are strongly conservative in Yemen, women are accepted as mediators in local conflicts among tribes and rural communities, and this is a long-held tradition. However, women are largely excluded from formal peace processes, and where they have been involved, women's groups have described their inclusion as disappointing, representing a missed opportunity for sustainable peace. And we know throughout our work the absolute necessity of including women in those peace discussions and negotiations at the early stages, and that when you do that, the likelihood is you will have a far better, far more sustainable outcome in a peace negotiation. Critically, the world must stop fueling the conflict by selling weapons for use in the war. Homes, schools, hospitals, as well as our own water projects have been repeatedly bombed. Arms sales from the US, UK, EU and others are fueling this man-made crisis and are legitimising, prolonging and deepening a conflict that is causing immense human suffering. US, EU and Canadian arms sales alone to the three biggest coalition players in the war, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Egypt, totalled over 33 billion between 2015 and 2017. Since 2015, UK arms licensed to Saudi Arabia has exceeded 4.6 billion. Oxfam supports the full and robust implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. The international community must refrain from sending any arms, ammunition or munitions for use in Yemen by parties to the conflict. Ireland and Yemen are not so far apart. Ireland has long-standing diplomatic engagements and opportunities for influence in relation to Yemen, as well as strong trade ties in surrounding countries. Ireland's new development policy, A Better World, sets out a firm commitment to reduce humanitarian need, intensify political efforts to address root causes of conflicts, and bolster engagement in fragile contexts. We recognise the Irish Government's action on Yemen to date, including the Minister of State Kieran Cannon's participation at the high-level pledging event in Yemen last month in Geneva, and Ireland's pledge of €5 million, bringing Ireland's overall support to the Yemeni people to over 22 million since 2012. We also recognise Ireland's advocacy for humanitarian access in Yemen, including resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review, the UPR, but to realise the values of a better world and to live up to the commitments of empathy, partnership and independence as set out in Ireland's UN Security Council campaign, we must do more. A seat at the UN Council would enable Ireland to have a strengthened role in international peace and security, and we'd certainly welcome this. So if Ireland wants to play this role, and it can, it needs to ensure that it does all it can to deliver on a successful outcome in Yemen, and there are many things it can do. It is critical that the Irish Government, specifically the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, would use all of Ireland's influence at EU and UN levels to apply pressure on all parties to respect international humanitarian law, negotiate and maintain a nationwide ceasefire, and approach peace talks with the best interests of the Yemeni people in mind. We would ask the committee to write to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade requesting an update on diplomatic efforts made by Ireland in relation to Yemen, and to request that Ireland press for the full commitment of warring parties and their backers to a ceasefire in Hadida, and to support the full implementation of the Stockholm Agreement as pillars for moving the peace process forward. As we requested during our previous appearance in front of this committee, we'd also recommend that the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade directs his department to use the embassy in Saudi Arabia to convene a meeting with its Saudi counterparts to make clear that Ireland unilaterally condemns the country's devastating bombing campaign in Yemen at the highest level and reiterate the need for a comprehensive ceasefire. Oxfam has been working in Yemen for 35 years, and we've never seen a humanitarian crisis on this scale. Yemenis face the triple threat of war, disease and hunger, and we see it, as does the UN, as the greatest humanitarian crisis on the planet today. It just doesn't seem to be getting the kind of attention that it needs. So we're urging the committee to do all you can to raise awareness and profile and space for it in the Irish context, so that Ireland can play its role internationally, and we do believe it can. So thank you very much for hearing my statement. Dina and I would both be really happy to discuss that further, and obviously Dina can give a lot more practical information on her experience on the ground.
Thank you very much, Jim, for your outline of a very desperate situation. And the reason we arranged for you to make a presentation to this committee was we want to try to get the message out as we can, as much as we can, to the Irish public create the greater awareness in relation to the threat of war, disease and hunger facing so many people. And when you 2/3 of the people in any country needing humanitarian assistance, paints a very, very grim picture. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much. And welcome, even though the words, the presentation is just so grim. And apologies, I have to go to speak in another little while. I was just struck. UK arms licences to Saudi has exceeded 4.6 billion. And yet, UK aid has reached the 0.7%. It's just total contradiction, incoherence. We look at arms sales from the EU, and the EU is a major donor of aid. You know, it's again coming back to the easy bit is giving the aid, and the difficult bit is facing the challenges. I see France and Germany have stopped selling arms, but they're probably selling arms somewhere else. So, and I think President Trump's recent announcement hasn't helped either. And there's no doubt it has gone off attention. I mean, for a period there, every time you turned on the news, it was about Yemen. But it's becoming forgotten now. And I think it's going to be consigned with other forgotten tragedies that we know about. So I just have two questions. One is about, I suppose, because I was at the presentation yesterday and the day before on access to medicines. How are you on that? And of course, we're looking at non-communicable diseases also. And are you able to get in the medicines that are needed, or, you know, we see people dying through conflict, through being shot, bombed, whatever, but through dying through illnesses that can be prevented and should be prevented. And then what you were mentioning about the attacks on humanitarian workers, how difficult it is for humanitarian workers. Okay.
Thank you very much. Jim or Dana? Yes, Dana.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for receiving us today. In relation to the access, in relation to the humanitarian supplies, we have repeatedly been facing difficulties in relation to bringing supplies. So last year, for example, we tried to bring supplies for cholera. That it was supposed to be a very quick, rapid sort of bringing in supplies from different countries, but we ended up in a situation where it took months before we could actually get the supplies in the country and then to actually distribute it within Yemen itself. And that's because of the access restrictions are twofold. One is to bring in supplies into the country, and then movement within the country itself is curtailed. So we have to have endless permits that we need to obtain, and that ended up in a situation where for at least 2 months after the supplies have reached Yemen, we have not been able to distribute that across the country. The concern at the moment is that we're facing this again now, because for cholera we definitely need supplies as well, and the UN is coming up with the list of the supplies needed, but we could well be facing the same situation that we faced last year with the access restrictions that we have. In relation to attacks on humanitarian workers, yes, I mean, this is something that it takes several sort of shapes. So in one hand, access itself, again, is an issue. So for us to access areas that we need to cover, the situation in certain parts of the country, we often get rejected. Our permits are rejected ourselves. We had in our team, we have had rejections of permits at least 3 times in the last 3 months. And that is not an isolated case. Most INGOs will tell you that they have been facing that. Checkpoints along the roads. If we want to go to an area such as Hajjah, which is it's not only a conflict area, but then also it's a place where high in cholera and also food insecurity, we find that there's at least 30 checkpoints between Sana'a and Hajjah, and along that route anything can happen. So having a checkpoint could mean that we are stuck, or it could mean that it's sailing through. We never know, and that is part of the obstacles that we're facing on a daily basis. We simply need to be acting very quickly, but we're struggling to do that with the restrictions that we face on the ground.
And we could just say, I take it you have to pay for various checkpoints.
No, I mean, we don't. What we do get is the permit, and on the basis of that permit, we refuse to pay.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks. Dina, Deputy Seán Crowe.
Good morning. Very, very welcome, and really appreciate you coming in here and giving the information to the committee itself. Clearly, one of the, I suppose, for people to live, food, clean water, the clean water situation, and you're saying that as part of your submission that many of the installations that Oxfam has been involved in have been bombed. What is the situation, really? Because imagine Yemen is a very, very warm country at times. Clean water is, essential to life. How are people managing in relation to that? The countries that are bombing, are they involved in the bombing of the installations, the water installations? Many of the solutions, I suppose when people at home, I suppose people are sitting in this room, you hear of, the scale of the conflict, the international players that are involved in it, and also Al Qaeda also involved. Are these various actors, are they involved in attacking Al Qaeda in the region? Is that their justification of being involved in the conflict, or is it part of this Iranian-Saudi Arabia conflict in the region, and with the support of the US, France, the UK, and in that area? The use of cluster bombs, maybe you might talk in terms of that. The solutions you outline, one of the suggestions is that the Irish government talk in terms of bringing in the Saudi ambassador. Do you believe that the Irish government should have a word with the British government in relation to their involvement, the French government, the US, the other players that are actors that are involved in this, and clearly are complicit by the supplying of weapons to the thing? Your hopes for the ceasefire, and you say that the solution is, it's a political solution. Your hopes for that is you're saying that the goods are getting in now, but the problem now is the stranglehold around those goods. So, in theory, the ceasefire is holding, but if you can't get the food and the medicines out to those people who need it, it makes a fallacy of what what was agreed at these talks. So, what do you see as politically as the way forward for do we need to? Does that aside from the port, does it need to include the free access of food and medicines and aid to the areas that are most affected? And lastly, I suppose the cholera epidemic is linked to the lack of clean water as well, lack of clean sanitation. So you might just expand on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Crowe. Dinah?
Yeah, sure. So in relation to clean water, yes, we've had at least 2 incidents where the water systems that we have installed, or the solar panels that we have installed, have been hit indirectly by airstrikes. So the airstrikes hit an area, but it was close to where we have actually provided the water systems, and that has affected those communities. For at least one of them, we have not been able to go back and actually sort out the damage that has occurred because of the lack of the lack of access, the restrictions in order to reach that particular area. But more generally, yes, clean water is an issue. We are seeing this not only in places such as Hajjah, Hodeidah, and Taz, but then also in places such as Sana'a. So now, and this is what's different about this cholera outbreak is that we are seeing the cases, also very high cases in Sana'a itself. And that is also linked to the sewage system is very old, is derelict, it needs to be replaced. But it's obviously very difficult under the current situation to have this big infrastructural projects around big cities across the country. So that is also contributing to the cholera, to the numbers that we are seeing at the moment, which are quite high, even in comparison with the previous rounds. And that's why we are concerned that for this particular round of cholera, we could well be surpassing the numbers of previous cholera outbreaks. In relation to the scale of the conflict and what we are seeing, yes, there is the ceasefire is supposed to be in Hodeidah. It's not a countrywide ceasefire. So what we're seeing is that the airstrikes are continuing, the ground level fighting is continuing in different parts of the country, where the ceasefire, although it's supposed to be holding in Hodeidah, we are still seeing ground level fighting happening in Hodeidah. So that is, all of these issues are affecting the access, are affecting our ability to respond, and that is why we are calling for a countrywide ceasefire and not only linked to Hodeidah, for us to be able to move around in order to reach communities in different parts of the country. And this also brings me to the Stockholm Agreement. So at the moment, what seems to be holding to some extent is the ceasefire in Hodeidah, but we're not seeing the next steps. We're not seeing the implementation of the agreement taking place. And that is why we're now in this position for almost since December, and we're not seeing the progress on the implementation. But at the same time, we're seeing a deterioration in the economy. We're also seeing the cholera, the re-emergence of cholera. So that is what all linked to the collapse, the slow collapse. I mean, Yemenis, if you talk to Yemenis, they'll tell you we're dying a slow death. And that's how they see it. And that's why they do not see that other countries are rallying for their support. And that's why we think Ireland has a particular role that it can actually play, because it is not involved in the arms transfers. It is in a unique position. It is supporting Yemenis, and it's a question now of whether some political leverage can also be added to that. I don't know if Jim, you want to add anything?
No, but I mean, I think that dying a slow death is a very strong image for us, and this is, but there comes a time when that becomes catastrophic. It's already catastrophic, but you know, we see what the numbers look like and what it could be. And it's just probably worth remembering that before the conflict, Yemen was the poorest country in the region by a distance. It is a very poor country already. But when you have 51% of the health services no longer functioning, even at the level they used to function before the crisis, you can imagine the impact that that would have. And then you throw an epidemic of cholera in on top of that, along with all the food crises and all the rest. So, I mean, the Stockholm Agreement, as we say, was a really positive step forward, an initial step. But like all peace agreements, and we know it well enough here, it requires ongoing monitoring, ongoing commitment, ongoing focus, ongoing political engagement, even during the tough parts of it. And it's not a linear process, and we have to keep at it and keep at it. And there's a sense that that's probably not happening at the moment. And so how do we, first of all, make sure that Hodeidah itself is completely accessible? And then how do we get things from, because there's no point in having it, as you say, stockpiled in Hodeidah. How do we ensure that there's a proper ceasefire across the country, and then an inclusive peace process that will take a long time, but that starts and that people feel connected to, and so that at least in the initial stages the humanitarian access is there to really deliver the support that's needed, and then we start to gradually rebuild.
Just for your own background, how frustrating is it for you that the lack of coverage, the lack of media coverage of the actual conflict itself? Is that one of the most depressing part? You're seeing people dying. You're seeing the conflict at first hand. But It's not on the front pages of a paper. It's not on CNN. It's not on Sky News. It's rarely mentioned at all, and if it is, it's a Bible.
Context as opposed to humanitarian context, and either way is important. But I mean, you're right. I mean, this is the world's worst humanitarian crisis by a distance, and this is according to the UN and everybody else who's working there, including ourselves. It should be front page all the time. It should be, that's what we would say. It should certainly be there. It should be constantly, on our minds and on the public's minds. And it isn't now. There are also issues of access, even from media perspective. It's not an easy place to come. We have looked at bringing media and so on. That's not a reason that it shouldn't continue. We shouldn't continue to work on that. And how do we, influence all of the key actors there to ensure that there's that kind of access too? Because people respond, governments respond when they know, when they're clear, when it's put in front of them, and we need to work harder to make that happen.
Thanks. Deputy Seán Barrett.
Thank you. First of all, I welcome you both and thank you for coming in. I think it's important that what's happening in a place like Yemen is highlighted in the public domain, and I have to be truthful and honest about it. There's very little that we talk about when it comes to foreign affairs matters about Yemen, and the ignorance, I would say, including my own, until you read the documentation that you've supplied us with, isn't generally known. And I hope that today's meeting could help to highlight and to do so on a continuous basis. It's an outrage in that part of the world. It's not through out and out poverty that these things are happening. It's something that should be solvable. And the fact that there's no great publicity about the ongoing acts does nothing to highlight the problems. And so anything we can do, I think it is important that we continue to meet and get an update on this situation. So what I'm suggesting, Chairman, would be that maybe after a period we invite these people back in again to keep highlighting this situation, because, let's be honest about it, we're members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm first to put my hand up to say that my knowledge of the atrocities that are happening are fairly limited, and I put my hand up and apologise that is the situation, but it's a fact. What we need to do is highlight, and unfortunately, as you can see, there isn't a great attendance at the media at our meetings when it comes to discuss these sort of issues, and therefore even through this committee we find it difficult to get the necessary publicity about what's happening. So I think everything we can do as a committee to highlight these atrocities in Yemen and other parts of the world where these atrocities have taken place, I think it's what we can do as a committee. And I just want to say that anything on my own behalf that we can continue to meet with you and to highlight what's happening. And I just think that it's quite frightening. When I read the documentation, I was quite frightened about that this is happening and nothing is being said about it. So your request to ask the committee to write to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade requesting an update on diplomatic efforts made by Ireland in relation to Yemen, I don't think that's too heavy of a request to make to us. In fact, I would suggest, Chairman, that alone should be right, but I think we should invite the Minister in to discuss these situations and this particular one. And again, your request that Ireland uses its influence at EU and UN level is something that is not a very big request, but again, it's highlighting the issue. And I think, if I may suggest, Chairman, that both of these requests, we should formally make a presentation in writing before we're inviting the Minister in and asking if these things be done as a committee. So that's basically what I want to say, but I congratulate you for continuing bringing these matters to our attention. It's something that it's very easy to forget about these parts of the world. And I must say, I find it quite horrific that it's not through poverty. You know, if it was poverty that was causing this, it's not, and it's in a relatively, reasonably off part of the world, but, it's a place that seems to be forgotten about, and I think that's our job, is to make certain that we highlight what's happening there. So I'd suggest, Chairman, that we do, as requested in the report, that we contact the Minister for Foreign Affairs and ask him if at all possible he would come and visit and to highlight what's happening in Yemen. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Barrett. Do you want to make any comment, Jim?
Look, we appreciate the sentiment and your support. And look, this is a kind of a collective effort, I suppose. We acknowledge that Ireland can only do so much, but it can do things, and Ireland plays an important role in the world for the size of our country. We have access to extraordinarily influential people. Interestingly, Nancy Pelosi being here yesterday was one of the people that slapped down the US President in relation to the veto. She was immediately connected to that. So we are in those spaces as Ireland, and we can use that voice as an honest country that genuinely wants to do the right thing. But we shouldn't be afraid to raise the issues and be clear what our position as Ireland is in these matters.
Thanks, Jim. Senator Ivana Bacik.
Good Chair, and thank you both very much for that really compelling presentation. And apologies, I was a little late to it. But it's, as the others have said, it makes for a grim listening to hear the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe, and I think you've given us a really clear picture of it, and the focus on the gendered aspect, on the devastating impacts on women and children in particular, that really brings it home. I'm struck, as others have been, by your comment that the only real solution is a political one, and I would obviously support what Deputy Barrett has said, that I think we're your asks are very reasonable. I think we as a committee chair should absolutely write to the Minister to request the update and to seek to use Ireland's influence. And I note you've got a specific request also that the Taoiseach should direct his department to use the embassy in Saudi Arabia to convene a meeting with Saudi counterparts. So I think we should include that in our letter as well. Now, we do have an update from the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I note that we've been told the Taoiseach met with the Saudi ambassador in October 2018 and in February 2019, so quite recently, to stress Ireland's concerns around humanitarian access. We haven't been told whether our embassy in Saudi has made representations there, so I think maybe we should emphasise that. Clearly there's been a huge focus on Saudi as a key player in this and arms sales to Saudi. So I suppose I have two questions. One is whether we can do more as a small country within the EU to press our EU partners to discontinue our arms sales, particularly to Saudi, but also to the UAE and Egypt and indeed to Iran, all of whom are also players in the conflict. So can we do more on that front? I know the UK is there's been a lot of focus on British sales, but on other EU countries as well. And secondly, just in terms of those other players, UAE, Egypt and Iran, what more can we do there? And again, we've been told the Department has conveyed to the Iranian embassy here Ireland's strong concerns on the safety of civilians and compliance with international humanitarian law, but we haven't been told whether any representations have been made by Ireland to the UAE or to Egypt. So I wonder if you have any comment on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Bacik. Dana?
Yeah, just to say, in relation to the other countries with leverage in relation to the conflict in Yemen, Iran and UAE, definitely I think in relation to UAE, the similar messages they are going to Saudi Arabia, those are the types of messages need to go to UAE as well. In relation to Iran, and I think it's important to note that you know, the advocacy in relation to Saudi Arabia and UAE is only likely to be successful if we're equally addressing other parties with leverage to all sides in the conflict. And as such, it's important that we do not know, for example, what Iran is doing in relation to pushing the Houthi authorities in the north on access, on other issues that are being faced. And I think it's important that that is also equally applied as well. At the end of the day, the transfer of arms are happening to all sides of the conflict. It's not happening to one side and not the other. So that message, I think, needs to go across the board. In relation to UAE, I think it's important. We know that UAE is playing an important role in the south of Yemen in particular, but also it's important to note that the impact of the conflict is not only affecting the north and the sort of the conflict areas in the north, but is having a devastating impact across the country, even in parts of the country in the south where there's actually no live conflict. And I think that's an important point to note, that, you know, it's not a question of, for example, the US, for example, will say that this is important to fight Al-Qaeda because actually the whole country is now in a situation where people are starving and cholera is rampant, etc. So it's important to show the impact, the humanitarian impact of the conflict as a whole, of arms transfers across the country. And in relation to Egypt, again, that's a question. It's part of the coalition, so all members of the coalition, I think, will need to be addressed in that respect. Thank you.
Done by Oxfam and by other agencies on the ground.
Thank you very much, Senator Bacik. Could I thank Jim and Dinah again for the detailed presentation? And obviously, it's frightening to think of this country again being facing the triple threat of war, disease, and hunger, as you said earlier. And the reason we have you before our committee is to try to create a greater awareness among the public here in our own country in relation to this ongoing conflict that's now in its 4th year. And as my colleagues have said, unfortunately, we don't hear as much about this conflict on the international broadcast media as we should. And when you outlined very clearly that 24 million people out of a population of 30 million are in need of humanitarian assistance, the huge loss of life, and it's absolutely reprehensible, the actions of the Saudi-led coalition in blocking food and medicine getting to people who are starving and dying and suffering so much. It's absolutely reprehensible, so it is. And it's so disappointing to think that that Yemen continues to experience the world's worst humanitarian crisis, again in the 4th year of conflict. And you made the very valid point, both Jim and Dina, in regard to the Yemeni women and girls exposed to many risks, including gender-based violence, on top of the suffering already, to think that the girls and women are subjected to further gender-based violence as well. It's a huge indictment on the international community. And you, in the conclusion of your presentation, Mr. Clerkin, you asked that this committee would write to the Minister for Foreign Affairs in regard to the need for Ireland to continue to use its influence at every forum available to us, through the European Union, through the United Nations, to apply pressure on all parties to respect international humanitarian law. And also, with the approval of the committee, we'll also write to the Minister requesting an update on what diplomatic efforts we are pursuing with the Saudi authorities, particularly in regard to the blocking of products, of essential foodstuffs and essential medicines going through the port of Hudaida. And, of course, the full implementation of the Stockholm Agreement would be critical. We will ask the Taoiseach as well to seek that the embassy in Saudi Arabia would convene a meeting with the Saudi counterparts to raise all of these basic human rights issues and issues of such concern to people who are concerned about the lack of humanitarian assistance getting to the people in need. We've listened to many presentations at this committee, and I don't know in any country where there has been conflict or that, I don't know if there was ever as a high proportion of the population needing that humanitarian assistance, as we talk about 24 million people out of 30 needing that humanitarian assistance. We would be very glad to write to the Tánaiste Minister for Foreign Affairs and asking him to pursue to pursue through each forum that's available, the United Nations, European Union, and also through our diplomatic network, to continue to put on all the pressure we can to ensure that a peaceful resolution is found, because it's terrible to think that a country is facing what you put so well, the triple threat of war, disease and hunger. So I thank both of you for your detailed presentation, and to compliment the people who are working out there in very difficult circumstances, from your own organisation and from sister organisations as well. Deputy Seán Crowe.
I just think it's important, you know, and bear in mind, you know, what was said here today, that like there's other actors, not just the Saudis, involved in this, and I think it's important that if we're going to contact a particular embassy, I know we have an embassy in Saudi Arabia, but I think it's important that we actually formally contact all those countries that are actually involved in the region and have the same message.
Yeah, we can put that in our letter to the Tánaiste. That would meet with your request as well, as Deputy Barrett said. So I just want to thank Jim and Dina for their presentations, and also to welcome their colleagues, who, as I did earlier, who have been with us as well. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank you again for the presentation, to wish you well with your work. And as Deputy Barrett said, we would be glad to have the opportunity to meet with you again, but hopefully we wouldn't need to, that there might be some progress. But if the need arises that we need to keep this issue on the agenda to try to help to create some awareness, we will do that. Jim?
If I could just close by saying thank you very much. It's really appreciated, and you've become advocates for this, and we need advocates here in Ireland as well as globally. Peace is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible. And I think absolutely it's crucial that we use whatever diplomatic influence we have with all actors, as opposed to one or the other. And so there are a number of actors, and we know who they are, and Ireland has various relations with all of them and can do a lot. But it's really heartening to hear the passion and the commitment from here, and really, really appreciate it. So just to say thank you so much.
Thank you very much. While I understand this committee may be asked to play a role in proceedings for Europe Day on the 9th of May, arrangements are not yet finalised and will be proposed to members in due course. Accordingly, our next scheduled meeting of the Joint Committee is with the Representative Association of Commissioned Officers. And could I just say, we're adjourning this meeting now, and our Select Committee will meet at 11:15. So thank you very much.